Hello there, welcome to this Meanwhile Elsewhere on the Pendle Witch Trials. Part of this video, you're going to learn some new vocabulary, which is going to help you with this topic. The word demonology, that was a book about witchcraft written by King James I. To denounce means to publicly accuse someone of being guilty. Justice of the peace is a local law enforcement official in that time period, such as Roger Nowell, who we found out about in the story. A Puritan is a very strict Protestant. A recusant is someone who refused to go to church in the 16th and 17th century, and witchcraft is practicing magic for evil purposes. So we're going to find out now about the story of the Pendle Witch Trials. Year is 1612. Woman is in a courtroom. She's accused of killing 3 men through witchcraft. She's presented with a confession, but she denies it. Then a girl is brought to testify against her. The woman screams at the girl desperately, and the girl bursts into tears. The woman is removed back to the dungeons. The girl jumps onto her table and denounces the woman as a witch. The girl is the woman's daughter. The girl is just 9 years old. The girl is called Janet Davis. She is a key witness in one of the most famous witch trials of the 17th century. The trial will lead to the execution of 10 people, including all members of the girl's own family. 20 years later, in 1633, Janet will be in the dock herself. She will be charged with the same offence. This is a story about fear, politics, religion, science, and of course magic. This is the story of the Pendle Witch Trials. Witchcraft in the 17th century. We started to get witchcraft laws that were passed in the 1500s in the rule of Tudor monarchs such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, but the real peak of witchcraft accusations came in the 17th century, the 1600s. Now, a major change in this is when King James I becomes king in the year 1603. But lots of factors have come together in the 17th century to cause there to be more witchcraft accusations. Monarchs passed laws to tackle witchcraft, which meant people believed in the idea of witches more. Economic problems such as poor harvests meant people blamed witches when times were tough. You get a poor harvest, you blame the witch. A lack of scientific understanding meant that people sometimes blamed witches if people got ill or suffered from an accident. Meanwhile, the English Civil War later on in the 17th century saw a huge increase in witchcraft accusations. Many witchcraft accusations were made by Puritans who were strict Protestants, many of them against people who perhaps were Catholics, and we see a huge increase in witchcraft accusations in areas where there were lots of Puritans living. So how were witches identified? Well, witchcraft accusations usually began after an accusation from somebody in a village or town. Neighbours would provide evidence. Accused witches would be accused of having an unusual mark on their body. It might be a birthmark or a wart, which was seen as being the sign of the devil. Some women were even tortured, resulting in confessions. Some women were accused of having an animal that did the devil's work called a familiar. And in 1612, King James I introduced the swimming test. That was the same year as the events of the Pendle Witch Trials. Now, what the swimming test was, it was when an accused witch was thrown into the water. If she sank, she was innocent. If she did not, it was evidence that she was a witch. Sometimes, when a woman sank, they accidentally drowned. Now, the swimming test brought in by King James I, the idea as well was that a suspected witch would not be baptized. The water would reject them, causing them to bob on the surface. So that's another bit of evidence about the swimming test. Okay, back to the Pendle Witch Trials. So by 1612, King James I has been ruling for 9 years, and he's still fearful of Catholic rebellions after the failed gunpowder plot of 1605. King James I is obsessed with witchcraft. He's even written a book called Demonology, all about witchcraft, and it's a bestseller. In March 1612, he orders local justices of the peace to get together a list of people called recusants. These are people who refuse to go to church. He has the county of Lancashire in his sights. Lancashire has been described as a dark corner of this land that has long been seen as a lawless and rebellious county. Local officials are actively looking for rebels and then looking for witches. And one official in particular is keen to make a name for himself. His name is Roger Nowell. This shows you a map of where Pendle Hill is, and this is the area of Lancashire, just north of Burnley, that we're talking about here. And you can also see there the very famous and iconic Pendle Hill, which we'll mention again at the end of this presentation, why that's important in the witchcraft accusations. So in Pendle in Lancashire in 1612 lived 2 rival families, and they're headed up by 2 women in their 80s. One is called Elizabeth Demdike, and she's known as Old Demdike, and she's known as a cunning woman. She provides basic medical remedies for people. And these cunning women were quite important within local communities, particularly amongst poorer people. They could often be people's only opportunity to get any medical help. Now, sometimes she could heal people. Other times people accused her of harm, perhaps if they did not recover from their illness or whatever injury was afflicting them. Now, the other family was headed up by Anne Chattox or Anne Whittle, but known mostly as Old Chattox. The two families are rivals, and they're known as the Demdikes and the Chattoxes. Now, the feud between the families dates back to an event when one of the Chattox family broke into Malkin Tower, the home of the Demdike family, and stole some money. Now, Malkin Tower sounds quite grand, but really it was a very dilapidated and not particularly nice house. The scene is set for one of the most famous witch trials of the 17th century. Now, in 1612, Janet Devis is living at Malkin Tower, and you can see there that she had a brother called James and a sister called Alison, who we're going to be finding out quite a lot about. Now, Elizabeth Demdike, or Old Demdike, has been accused of being a witch for over 50 years, but she's never ended up in court and never ended up in prison. But things gather pace in 1612, though, when the local Justice of the Peace, Roger Noel, begins to actively look for witches in Lancashire. Now, on the 18th of March 1612, Demdike's granddaughter, Alison Devis, is walking down a country lane, and she comes across a man called John Law. Now, he is a trader from Halifax, and Devis stops him, and she tries to buy some metal pins from him. Now, he's obviously quite scared of Alison Devis, perhaps thinking that she was a witch, and he refuses to sell them and walks on, obviously quite frightened by Devis. She gets frustrated, and she responds, and she curses him. But what happens this time is that it seems to work. John Law collapses and he falls to the floor. He can't speak or move, and he's rushed to a nearby inn. Alison panics. She knows she has bewitched him. She rushes to his bedside and begs for forgiveness, although he later recovers, and then he accuses Devis of bewitching and cursing him. Now, thinking about his symptoms from what he had, it's pretty clear that John Law had a stroke, perhaps because he was so stressed and frightened by Alison Devis. So the interesting thing about this case is that Alison Devis does believe that she has bewitched John Law. And John Law does believe that he has been bewitched, and this has obviously had a physical impact on him. So the case of Alison Devis is reported to the local JP, Roger Noel. He investigates and interviews Alison Devis, and she confesses to everything. She also accuses her neighbour, Anne Chattox, of being a witch. Alison's statement sparks a feud between the Demdikes and the Chattoxes. The Chattox family begin to accuse Old Demdike of witchcraft, and the feud spills out and is everything that Roger Noel was hoping for when he began to look for witches in Lancashire in 1612. So on the 2nd of April, 1612, Noel arrests Alison, Old Demdike, Anne Chattox, and Anne Redfern. 4 of them arrested. They're taken off to Lancaster Castle and they're held as prisoners. Elizabeth Demdike and Anne Chattox both confess to being witches. Now, Roger Noel is the Justice of the Peace, and he hopes the arrest would impress King James I and perhaps make a name for himself. He's an ambitious man. He's also a big believer in witchcraft, James I. Roger Noel also hoped to crack down on Catholics in Lancashire at the same time. A very important event happens on Good Friday, which is the 10th of April 1612. Elizabeth Devis organises a meeting, or perhaps a party, at the family home of Malkin Tower. James Devis allegedly steals a sheep to feed the family and their friends. He's only a 14-year-old boy at the time. What happens at this meeting will become the subject of great interest, and some will later say it was a gathering of witches. Everyone present was then arrested by the local constable. Rumours swirl around the community that many other people were there, and more people are arrested on suspicion of witchcraft. Roger Noel is again sent to investigate, and he accuses more people of witchcraft. Malkin Tower will later be demolished. Noel sends another 8 people to Lancaster Castle to await trial. Janet herself, though, is not arrested, Janet Devis. Where she spent the next 4 months, historians do not know. Now, most people in the Pendle Witch Trials who were arrested were poor and who were accused of witchcraft, but one surprising feature was the arrest of Alice Nutter. And we can see here a statue commemorating Alice Nutter just on the right-hand side. It's unlikely she was at all associated with events at Malkin Tower or associated with witchcraft, but she was from a wealthy family called the Nutter family, who were a very strong Catholic family, and two of her relatives were Catholic priests. It's likely that she got caught up in all the witchcraft accusations and was arrested due to being a Catholic. And this gives you a sense of some of the religious turbulence and religious change that was still happening in the 17th century, no doubt a consequence of the English Reformation from the previous century. Now, those accused of witchcraft ended up in Lancaster Castle. Lancaster Castle was used as a prison actually right up until the year 2011. What you can see here is the Witch's Tower at Lancaster Castle, where the prisoners were kept until their trial. Now, before she can actually be properly tried, old Demdike, remember she was old, she was in her 80s, she dies in the filthy and grimy cell whilst awaiting trial, so she never goes on trial herself. So the trial begins in the courtroom at Lancaster Castle on the 18th of August 1612. There are two judges, a jury, witnesses, and all the defendants at the trial. The clerk is called Thomas Potts, and we'll come back to him in a moment, and he's scribbling detailed notes. Alison Devis does not even want to defend herself. She admits her guilt straight away. However, Elizabeth Devis protects her innocence with great vigour. This is when Janet Devis is brought in to testify against her. She will calmly denounce her own mother as a witch, claiming she was able to take on the spirit of a brown dog to kill people. Janet will go on to denounce others who were there at the meeting on Good Friday at Malkin Tower, accusing them of witchcraft too, including her own brother James. She is, in short, the star witness of the court. Without her evidence, nobody is going to get convicted. 10 people are found guilty of witchcraft in the trials after the two-day trial ends. The evidence stacks up perfectly, all based on the evidence of Janet Devis. They're all sentenced to hang. From the Chattox family, old Chattox, Anne Chattox and Redfern, they are sentenced to death. And from the Demdike family, we've got Elizabeth Devis, sometimes known as Squinting Lizzie because of the appearance of her eyes, James Devis and Alison Devis. They're all sentenced to hang. Of course, old Demdike had already died in jail. But alongside the two families, there are Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, Jane Bulcock, John Bulcock, and Isabel Roby. Many of these are Catholics in terms of why they have ended up at the Pendle Witch Trials. So after they're found guilty, the 10 are brought to a place called Gallows Hill, where they are hung. This is a picture of what the place looks like now. It doesn't really betray what it was used for back in 1612. Elizabeth and Alice Nutter never confess, even with their dying words. It's likely that Janet Devis would have been there to witness what happened to her own family. We've got no source records of what happened to Janet immediately afterwards. Now, witchcraft accusations continued into the 17th century, and in November 1633, a 10-year-old boy from Pendle called Edmund Robinson returned home late to tell his parents a strange story about an encounter that he'd had with a group of witches. He tells all sorts of interesting stories about seeing a gathering of up to maybe 60 witches. Now, the boy's father believes him, and he takes him from village to village to point out witches that he'd maybe seen. 20 people were subsequently imprisoned on the basis of Edmund's story and put on trial in February 1634. Now, what's fascinating about this is that one of those put on trial was Janet Devis, accused of killing a member of the Nutter family. 17 people were found guilty. However, what was different about this case was that the case is referred to the King and Privy Council due to a lack of evidence at the time. By 1634, King Charles I was king, and he was less convinced about witchcraft. Remember, his religious beliefs were much more sympathetic towards Catholicism. The case is later reviewed. Edmund Robinson later admits to lying, and Janet Devis is acquitted. Shows the change in witchcraft that just took place just in that sort of 20 or so years between the two cases. So how do we know about this story? Well, almost everything we know about this event comes from a book written by Thomas Potts called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster. You might remember his name from earlier on. He served as clerk to the court in Lancaster during the time of the trial, and he wrote up his notes into this book to show people how rigorous the trial was. The whole book is a very detailed account of a 17th century witch trial, despite it being written, of course, to impress the government of King James I, and of course there's evidence for the thoroughness of the court and of Thomas Potts himself. Now, one last interesting thing to tell you, when the snow melts from Pendle Hill, which you can see a picture of there, the last bit of snow remaining makes the image of a witch. Today, the town still has many shops about witches. People are keen to visit to find out more about the story of the Pendle Witch Trials. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Bye-bye.